He had been a firefighter once, the kind of man who ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. But after the flames took his crew, the silence that followed burned even deeper. For years, he drifted from town to town, haunted by the faces he couldn't save, carrying the smell of smoke in every memory. On a bitter winter night, lost and half frozen, he stumbled upon a small house on the edge of Ashford, Maine. An old teacher lived there, a woman whose quiet kindness would ignite something he thought was long dead. What happened inside that home would soon ripple through the entire town, turning grief into grace and reminding everyone that even in the ashes of loss, there is still light. Stay until the end, because this story will reach the part of your heart you didn't know was waiting to feel again. Snow drifted in lazy spirals over the town of Ashford, blanketing the rooftops and muffling every sound until the world seemed to breathe in slow motion. The streets were empty except for the faint golden glow of porch lights flickering through the storm. It was the kind of winter night that made even the ocean fall quiet, its waves frozen into a low whisper beyond the dark cliffs. Inside a modest yellow house on Pine Hill Road, Helen Crawford sat by the fire, the steady crackle of burning wood keeping her company. She had spent the evening reading essays written by her students, their clumsy words reminding her of the eager minds she had once guided in a classroom full of chalk dust and laughter. Retirement had given her time, but it had also brought a stillness she never quite learned to love. Her husband had been gone for 12 years, yet she still caught herself setting out 2 cups of tea or turning to share a small comment with someone no longer there. The warmth of the fire softened the edges of her loneliness. Around her, the room carried traces of a life well lived. Shelves overflowing with novels, framed photographs fading gently with time, a gramophone that hummed low jazz when she needed it most. The snow outside reflected against the windows, making the entire house appear like a lantern glowing against the dark. Helen glanced toward the clock above the mantel. It was nearly midnight. She pulled the knitted shawl tighter around her shoulders and sighed, the kind of quiet sigh that comes from habit rather than sadness. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the bare branches against the window panes. Somewhere far off, a church bell marked the hour. The town slept beneath a blanket of white, peaceful and undisturbed. Helen rose to add another log to the fire, the scent of pine resin mixing with the faint aroma of chamomile still lingering in her cup. For a moment, she thought about writing a letter to her sister in Vermont or maybe calling an old friend, but the hour was late and the comfort of routine felt safer than conversation. She moved slowly through the room, touching the familiar surfaces as if to reassure herself that time had not stolen everything she cared for. Then, just as she settled back in her armchair, a sound broke through the stillness, a heavy, uncertain knock at the door. It was so out of place in that sleeping town on that frozen night that for a moment she wondered if she had imagined it. The fire hissed softly and the wind moaned around the corners of the house, but the knock came again, louder this time, echoing through the quiet rooms. Helen's heartbeat quickened. No one visited Pine Hill Road after dark, especially not in a storm. She hesitated only a moment before rising, her slippers brushing against the rug, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the doorknob. The snow outside glowed pale in the porch light, and the shape of a man stood motionless beyond the glass. When Helen pulled the door open, the wind rushed in first, carrying a spray of snow that bit against her skin. Standing on the porch was a man half buried in the storm, his figure barely visible beneath the heavy coat clinging to his shoulders. His fire jacket was faded and stained with soot, its reflective stripes dulled by years of wear. Snow clung to his hair and eyelashes, and his face was pale with exhaustion. The porch light cast a fragile glow across his features, revealing deep lines etched by sleepless nights and unspoken pain. His eyes, dark and sunken, held the kind of emptiness that spoke of something more enduring than physical cold. Each breath he took came out as a thin cloud of mist, trembling in the frozen air. His boots were caked in slush, and his gloves looked soaked through. Helen could see that he had been walking for some time, maybe miles, judging by the snow piled on his shoulders. For a moment, neither of them moved. The storm howled behind him, pressing its weight against the door as if urging her to decide. The man's posture was one of quiet defeat. He stood slightly hunched, as though the burden of the world had settled permanently on his back. Helen's gaze drifted to the patch on his sleeve, half hidden by frost. Ashford Fire and Rescue. Recognition stirred faintly in her memory, a flicker of a headline she had once read, a story that had made the entire town fall silent. The man looked as though he had walked straight out of that tragedy and in her doorway. Without speaking, she stepped aside, her instincts stronger than her hesitation. The warmth of the house spilled outward, wrapping around him like a fragile promise. He crossed the threshold slowly, as if uncertain he was allowed inside. The moment the door closed, the storm's roar faded into a muffled hum, leaving only the faint crackle of the fireplace. The man stood by the entryway, melting snow dripping from his jacket onto the rug, steam rising faintly from his shoulders. He looked around the room with wary eyes, not as a guest, but as someone who had forgotten what safety felt like. Helen could see how thin he was beneath the layers of fabric, how his fingers trembled even when he tried to steady them. When he finally removed his gloves, his hands were raw and red from the cold, his knuckles scarred in a way that spoke of both work and loss. He stayed near the fire, but did not sit, as though afraid to leave a trace of himself behind. His eyes followed the movement of the flames with something close to fear, but there was also longing there, an unspoken recognition of warmth he hadn't felt in years. Helen watched him from across the room, her mind searching for a name. It came back slowly, the way distant memories do. Eli Parker, the firefighter who had survived when others hadn't. She remembered the newspaper photo, his face darkened with soot, his eyes filled with the hollow disbelief of survival. The Mill Street warehouse fire. 4 men lost. 1 left alive. The town had mourned for months, and then he had vanished. Now, 3 years later, he stood in her living room, a ghost wrapped in a fireman's coat, thawing in the light of her hearth. Eli sat in the armchair closest to the fire, his body leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the flames as if they held the answers to something only he could see. The firelight danced across his face, revealing deep shadows beneath his eyes and a roughness that spoke of sleepless nights spent behind the wheel. The smell that clung to his uniform was faint but distinct, the kind of old smoke that seeps into fabric and never truly leaves. It wasn't the scent of an active blaze, but of memory, stale, lingering, and impossible to wash away. The house was silent, except for the soft crackle of burning wood and the slow rhythm of Helen's movements in the kitchen. Eli's hands were clasped together, his knuckles pale, the muscles in his forearms tense, as if bracing for something that had already happened. His mind replayed scenes he wished he could forget, the sound of collapsing beams, the sharp hiss of oxygen tanks igniting, the screams cut short by smoke. He remembered the radio static that followed, the heavy silence that meant the fire had taken more than just property. The medals they had given him afterward still lay somewhere in the back of his truck, wrapped in a towel, untouched since the ceremony. They had meant to honor him, but to Eli they felt like accusations cast in bronze. The town had called him a hero, yet every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the 4 men who hadn't made it out, their laughter echoing in the back of his mind, replaced by the sudden, awful quiet when the roof came down. He tried to go back for them. He remembered the heat pressing against his mask, the sound of his own voice shouting names into smoke, the way the structure groaned before it gave way. The memory always ended the same way, the world turning white, then black, then nothing. When he woke in the hospital, they told him he had survived because he was lucky. He had never believed that. Since that night, the sound of a fire siren felt like a blade cutting through him. He had packed his things and left Ashford without saying goodbye, convinced that distance would dull the guilt. It hadn't. Every mile he drove brought him closer to the same ghosts. They sat in the passenger seat of his truck, silent and watchful. He had spoken to no one in months, his voice growing rusty from disuse. Sitting in that warm room, With the smell of tea and wood smoke softening the air, he felt both comfort and unease. The warmth seemed undeserved, almost foreign. His gaze never left the fire, but inside his chest something small shifted, a tremor of grief that had nowhere left to hide. Helen's presence filled the space quietly, her calmness steadying the air around them. The gentle clinking of porcelain from the kitchen and the rhythmic tick of the clock on the mantel seemed to anchor the moment in something real. When she set a cup of tea beside him, the faint aroma of chamomile drifted upward, fragile and human in a way that cut through the weight of memory. He didn't thank her, but his fingers brushed the cup as if to remind himself it was there, warm and solid against the cold ache that had lived in him for too long. The fire popped, a small spark jumping upward, and for the first time that night, Eli let his shoulders drop just slightly, as though the act of sitting still in someone's kindness was its own kind of surrender at wide dawn. The storm had quieted, leaving behind a landscape sculpted in silver and white. The sunlight filtered weakly through the frosted windows, catching the edges of the curtains and spilling across the wooden floor in soft, uneven lines. Helen moved quietly through the house, careful not to wake Eli. She had found him asleep in the armchair hours earlier, his body slumped forward, the exhaustion of too many nights without rest finally claiming him. At some point, she had draped a blanket over his shoulders, noticing how even in sleep his face carried tension, the kind that doesn't vanish with dreams. When he finally stirred that morning, there was a brief, unguarded moment in his eyes, a flicker of confusion before recognition returned. He looked around the room as if unsure how he had ended up there, his surroundings too calm to be real. Helen offered him breakfast, but he barely touched it. The tea cooled untouched beside his hand. She could see how little strength he had left, not from hunger, but from the constant weight of his memories. When he admitted that he hadn't slept properly in 2 nights, she didn't argue or ask questions. Instead, she simply guided him toward the small guest room at the end of the hall, the one filled with the scent of lavender and sunlight trapped in old quilts. He hesitated at the doorway, then stepped inside with the careful uncertainty of someone entering sacred ground. When she closed the door behind him, the silence in the house deepened, but it no longer felt empty. Later that morning, Helen stood by the kitchen phone, her fingers resting on the receiver for several long minutes before she gathered the courage to dial. The number came back to her in fragments, the same way a song resurfaces after years of quiet. When she heard the familiar voice on the other end, there was surprise first, then disbelief. It had been years since she and Ray Morales had spoken, but time hadn't softened the steadiness in his tone. She told him what had happened, her words slow and deliberate, as though each one might break the fragile stillness of the moment. When she said Eli's name, there was a pause, long, heavy, and full of memories neither of them needed to describe. The news traveled fast. In small towns like Ashford, it always did. Within hours, the brotherhood of firefighters began to stir, the men and women who had once worked beside Eli now calling one another, their voices hushed but urgent. They had all believed he had vanished for good, swallowed by grief too heavy to share. Ray gathered a small crew at the station, the same one Eli had commanded years before. The walls still bore the photographs of their fallen comrades, their smiles frozen in time. When Ray took Eli's old helmet down from its place on the shelf, dust clung to his fingers. He turned it over slowly, the weight of it grounding him in a mix of sorrow and resolve. As the day faded, Helen's house filled with the comforting smells of baking. She worked quietly, her movements steady, unaware of the soft vibration that began to rise from the distance. It started as a low hum, a rhythm carried through the frozen air, growing louder as it approached. The first flicker of red light appeared beyond the hill, then another, and soon the sound of engines echoed up the winding road. Eli had been sitting by the fire again, lost in the slow pulse of the flames, when the distant rumble drew his attention. He stood, unsure if it was real, and stepped to the window. The snow outside shimmered with flashes of blue and red, light bending across the glass in broken patterns. confusion turned to disbelief as he recognized the familiar shapes of the trucks pulling into the drive, the reflective lettering gleaming against the dusk. The door creaked open, cold air rushing in. He stepped onto the porch, his breath visible in the evening chill. The yard was filled with figures in uniform, their helmets glinting beneath the lights, their faces solemn but warm. In front of them stood Ray Morales, his coat zipped high against the wind, one hand gripping something worn and familiar. It was Eli's helmet, the same one he had left behind on the day he walked away from everything. Snowflakes drifted through the air as Ray stepped forward, his eyes meeting Eli's. The world around them fell into silence. No engines, no chatter, only the sound of the wind weaving through the pines and the weight of something unspoken between them. For the next 2 weeks, Helen's house changed in a way she hadn't expected. What had once been a quiet refuge for one became a gathering place for many. The word had spread through Ashford that Eli Parker had come back, not to fight fires, but to face the ones that still burned inside him. Each day, someone new arrived at her doorstep, an old colleague, a young recruit who had once trained under him, a neighbor who remembered the day the sirens wailed for the Mill Street fire. They came with casseroles, coffee, and stories. The air in the house filled with the sound of low voices and the hum of laughter that carried a trace of grief beneath it. Eli listened more than he spoke, but when he did, his words carried a strange gentleness, as though each one had been carefully weighed before leaving his mouth. He spent hours at the small wooden table near the window, a cup of tea beside him, a stack of yellowed paper, and a pen at hand. The first letter had been the hardest. He sat for almost an hour before writing a single word, his hand trembling slightly as though the ink itself held the weight of memory. Helen often joined him, sitting nearby with her own book or quietly knitting, giving him company without intrusion. Sometimes he would ask her for help finding a phrase that didn't sound hollow or a sentence that carried the right kind of truth. She had always known how to coax words from silence, and in those quiet afternoons, she became his teacher once more. The letters grew slowly, one for each family, one for each name he carried with him since that night. He didn't try to explain what had happened. He knew there were no explanations left that could matter. Instead, he wrote about who the men had been before the fire, their humor, their courage, the ordinary moments that made them more than heroes. By the end of the second week, a calm had settled over him, something almost fragile but undeniably real. The restless energy that had once haunted his eyes was fading, replaced by a stillness that looked like acceptance. One morning, just as dawn was breaking, Eli rose earlier than usual. The snow outside had begun to melt, leaving the ground wet and shining beneath the pale light. Helen found him standing by the window, already dressed in his uniform, the creases pressed and sharp as if he were reporting for duty. There was a clarity in his expression she hadn't seen before, a quiet resolve that made her chest tighten. He told her he wanted to make one final call. There was no ceremony in his tone, no grand gesture, only the calm certainty of a man who had finally reached the end of his long road. Helen made the call to Ray Morales, and by mid-morning, the old firehouse came alive with movement. The crew gathered in silence, their faces a mix of pride and sorrow. The station smelled of oil, smoke, and history. Eli stood before them, the morning light slanting through the high windows, catching the edges of his badge. His uniform looked almost new, but his hands, worn and scarred, told the truth of years spent fighting both real and invisible flames. He looked at each of them, one by one, and for the first time in years, his eyes were steady. When he spoke, his voice carried through the room like a slow, steady current, simple and without embellishment. He didn't ask for forgiveness or speak of regret. He only thanked them for their faith, their loyalty, their refusal to let him fade away. When he finished, the room stood in silence until Ray raised his hand in salute. The others followed, and the old brass bell above the door rang 3 times, a tradition reserved for those who had given everything. It wasn't an alarm this time, but a farewell. Eli closed his eyes as the sound washed over him, a faint smile touching his face. That night, the fire in Helen's hearth burned low. Eli lay in the guest room beneath the soft weight of the quilt, his helmet resting on the chair beside the bed. His breathing grew slow and even, the kind of rhythm that only comes when a burden has finally been set down. By morning, the house was still. The first light of dawn spilled gently through the curtains, touching the brass edge of the helmet. And for the first time in years, Eli Parker was at peace. The memorial took place on a pale morning, the kind where the air itself seemed to carry memory. The sky hung low and gray over Ashford, and a soft wind moved through the streets, carrying the faint scent of smoke from the firehouse chimneys. The town gathered quietly outside Station 7, where rows of folding chairs lined the parking lot and flags fluttered at half-mast. Snow had begun to fall again, thin and slow, each flake dissolving as it touched the wet ground. The crowd was larger than anyone had expected. Firefighters came from 3 counties, their uniforms pressed and dark against the white landscape, their helmets tucked respectfully under their arms. Beside them stood townspeople, former students of Helen's, and families who had once lived through the tragedy that had taken Eli's crew. They came not for spectacle, but for remembrance, drawn by something both somber and strangely luminous. The air buzzed faintly with a low hum of quiet conversation that stopped each time the wind changed direction. In front of the station stood a simple podium draped in the flag of Ashford Fire and Rescue. Behind it, a framed photograph of Eli Parker rested on an easel, his face lit by the steady gaze of a man who had carried both burden and grace. The bagpipes began softly, the notes rising through the cold air in long, mournful waves that seemed to reach beyond the crowd and into the hills beyond town. The sound wrapped around them, a song of farewell that spoke without words. When it faded, Helen stepped forward. The snow crunched beneath her boots, her breath forming small clouds that drifted into the gray morning. She looked smaller against the expanse of people before her, but her voice carried clearly when she began to speak. Her words were calm and measured, each one formed with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime teaching others to find meaning in sentences. She spoke of Eli's strength, not in the battles he had fought against flame, but in the quiet surrender that allowed him to be human again. She told them that courage was not always loud, that sometimes it looked like sitting in silence, asking for help, or forgiving oneself after years of trying not to. The crowd listened without movement, the weight of her words sinking deep into the stillness. When she finished, she stepped back, and the sound of the bell filled the air, 3 slow, deliberate rings that echoed across the town. Each one carried through the snow, bouncing off the frozen trees and the stone buildings, a ritual sound of farewell that marked not loss, but continuation. After the ceremony, the town unveiled a new sign at the training field. The wooden post bore the name Parker Grounds, carved in bold letters and polished to a soft sheen. Beneath it, a small bronze plaque gleamed faintly in the weak winter light. It read, "He answered the call, even his own." The words caught in Helen's throat when she read them, simple and perfect in their finality. The months that followed moved quietly through the rhythm of the seasons. When the next winter came, the snow returned heavier than before, blanketing Ashford in white silence. On the first evening of the storm, the bell at Station 7 rang 3 times, just as it had at the memorial. The sound carried across the town, up through Pine Hill Road, where Helen sat by her fire once again. She closed her eyes as the echo reached her, the memory of that morning flickering in her mind like the slow fade of embers. Outside, the world was soft with snow and shadow, the air still enough to hold the past without breaking it. She whispered into the quiet room, her voice barely louder than the crackle of the fire, and for a brief moment, it felt as though someone was there to hear her. The wind moved gently against the windows, and the last glow of the hearth shimmered against the walls. The fire was out, but the warmth remained.